Right. So this is related to tone and theme in the comic versus the movie, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully we can then talk about what the film did, right? So this is the scene with the comedian and the night owl. This is starts off with the funeral for the comedian and everyone reflecting on their little moments with him. So that's where we start up. Up here, it's essentially like a series of flashbacks of everyone watching the comedian's coffin getting buried. And let's not talk about how the movie made the burial of the comedian like so drawn out in a way that the comic, by nature of the sequential art, both decompresses it but makes it the same pace.
Yeah.
Right. So essentially, it's this moment where the night owl recalls a moment with the comedian, which is what we see here. This moment when there's these protesters.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to talk about what I've observed and then you should talk about what you observed. And it goes from his flinking to this wide shot of the owl ship just being there. And then essentially the comedian, the night owl firing tear gas into the crowd and the comedian then choosing to shoot some of them, right? Mm-hmm. So down here, he kind of shoots them, but they've largely dispersed because of the tear gas. And look at that mask, right? That's what you wanted to talk about. Like the GIMP mask is that and that and that, right? He looks fucking scary, right? Yeah. We know it's the comedian because of the kind of like shoulder pads, but also like who else are they fucking talking about? So how have they chosen to present this in the movie?
Well, can I just say before you jump into the movie, this was the moment where I at Christmas time I'd read the book and watched the movie, and without analyzing this particular scene, I brought it to your guys' attention because I'm like, this movie lionizes the comedian, whereas Alan Moore treats the comedian as the problem. And that to me is the whole thematic problem that Zack Snyder misses with the movie. And I had forgotten the mask, right? You're about to show the scene, and this scene paints the comedian as a hero, whereas the comic book this is a deranged man doing terrible things.
All right. So this is the side-by-side between the comic and the scene from the film. Actually, I might turn it down because otherwise we might get blocked.
What's the might in that, Stu?
Well, I don't think the visuals, I think with this stuff, the visuals are different enough. All right. So when they dwell on it, what I want to point out is the film spends a long time establishing the protesters as a threat. The comic, the protesters are not the threat. The threat with this framing over here is Night Owl and the fucking comedian. The film, look at the length of this tracking shot. Is like the protesters are a problem. And then there's the Kuro arrival, the cavalry coming in. Right?
And it's interesting how that looming over in one is lionizing and in the other it's threatening, because you can use it both ways.
Because in the book, this moment is supposed to be portraying like Night Owl's kind of mourning of the costume vigilantes having to turn themselves against the people that they were aspiring to protect, right? It's supposed to be, this was when it all went wrong. And that is not what the movie is doing at all.
And I don't even think they're conscious of necessarily the problem with starting with an establishing shot like that. But if you understand narrative point of view and what we're doing, we're not with the characters, the crowd, we're not inside their experience. What we are doing is witnessing their violence. And also this choice right here, the fire thrown on Night Owl is again showing the protesters as a threat. And this wide shot here again shows the protesters as a threat. And this is nothing that they're doing in the comic. In the comic, they're deliberately trying to be showing that it is fucking Gimp Man comedian and the Night Owl.
And he gets a can thrown at him.
Yeah. Okay. That does it. That's the joke. It's a fucking can. Right. That's the joke. It's a can that gets thrown at him, not a fucking firebomb. It's like, okay, guys, you've asked for this.
Yeah.
It's a freaking tin can. Like,
it's an
why
excuse
would they...
for the violence.
It's an excuse
for
the violence. They've made a choice to justify. So we understand the character motivation and the worldview. They are, and this is what the movie has gotten wrong.
Well, and Snyder has deliberately decided not to go with the Gimp mask for the comedian in this sequence.
Yeah, that's an absolute conscious choice. Given how slavish some of these frames are, Right. But then this moment right here, this is the one that you pointed out, because they've even got the line here that they go on, he's interacting with the crowd, and then she says,
My son's a police officer, you fucking faggots!
right, it's got the line verbatim, and he gets hit with the tin can, and then there's this moment here, so Snyder, but it's like, it's not in the fucking comic, right? This hero's landing is not in the fucking comic, because it makes him look like a fucking legend, as opposed to he's a guy that is beating up American citizens. And then he goes into their speech, right? Which is a very textually consistent speech, but the speech about the comedian saying, I am the American dream, this is what happened to it.
Yeah.
And all of this circles back to tone, right? Because we were talking about how tone is what matters so much, whereas the writing of that scene actually works, but the way that it is written doesn't. Like it pragmatically gets across all of the things that it needs to do to accomplish what it's doing, but it's the way that it's written and then shot, which is a problem.
In defense of the Zack Snyder film, it's not that it doesn't work. It's that it's saying something very fucking
right. Absolutely.
Right?
Very
like
fucking
Stephanie Parsons in the chat earlier said that the Snyder cut, Snyder film, because of its shorter length, had less time to spend on like the world and politics and for current issues. And I'm like, yeah, but the 2009 is playing out America post 9/11 and the role of like violence and hawkishness and fascism, and
we're the world's police, essentially. I say we as the American royal we.
And it's doing that visually as opposed and in music, like the music that they've got in the background of that scene, you know, like he's making so many choices that Alan Moore would just be spinning in his grave over. Not to say that that's right or wrong, right?
Or that he's in a grave.
Yeah.
Okay, so this brings us to violence.
He is a black magician. I'm sure he's got a grave somewhere.
Okay, so a cult magician.
No, he's a magician. Like, not a magician, a sorcerer. Like he practices black magic.
Yeah, but they don't call themselves magician. Jeez, what a way to understand, right? Okay, this brings us to vulnerability and violence, which is something that I think is the show sits somewhere between the film, but it lets us talk about two scenes. I want to talk about the opening attack on the comedian, and then we can talk about the silk owl, night owl, and the silk spectre in the alleyway, right? So I think the biggest difference that they made in the choice between the movie adaptation and the comic is the vulnerability of the superheroes. Night Owl in the comic is, that's their presentation of fat. Like, he just looks like me. Right down to the goggles. But they're definitely playing up as being like an impotent, overweight, middle-aged man. And in the movie, he very quickly, as much as they're kind of like putting the geek glasses and stuff, it's basically like he takes the glasses off and it's like that moment from like a, and teen movie where it's like, oh my God, they're so hot. Right. Like they've gone that. But it's particularly also the way they treat bodies. That the bodies in the comic are vulnerable, that it's very clear that the superheroes are not, that the costume vigilantes are just vigilantes. They're not super abilities. They're very well trained. And this kind of is very clear right from the opening. So this is the opening few pages of the Watchmen. What's really cool, and Mel hopefully will get the opportunity to talk about parallel timelines. One of the things that the comic does is uses color palettes to do intercutting. So essentially the red is the flashbacks, the kind of red tinted panels, the flashbacks to the comedian's death. And then the green tinted palettes are the ones that are the present day of the police officers investigating, right? But there's very little of the fight, right? They're just like flash frames of them trying to piece together the fight from the evidence. The movie has made a decision to present us the fight as the opening scene, right? So it's not a flashback, so we're not getting moments pieced together from the evidence, but it's also the presentation of what happens to the comedian that's important. And what I want to say quite off the bat is that the violence against the comedian is he is basically given a level of super ability that is implausible, right? And is inconsistent with the comic.
Well,
this is cut. This is me just cutting the extreme moments. It's like it's a 2-minute fight. Like they've literally taken that compressed thing and make it a whole big fight sequence. They've kind of already heroed it out But then there's these moments of like, oh God, you'll see it like, okay, slow motion here, kicks open the door, but then he's like getting the shit beaten out of him. Like that's, fuck, as someone who actually does like martial arts, that's a serious beating. It will fuck you up. And then this punches like shit off wall. Who has ever punched their hand through a fucking wall and not broken every bone gets thrown into like a fucking glass? Look at this. He catches a meat cleaver. This is like superpowers. This is not in the comic at all. These guys have superpowers. Like that is just insane.
Let's just acknowledge that the assailant, not the comedian, but the assailant is Ozymandias, who both in the comic and in the TV show catches a flying bullet.
Oh, okay.
It does.
That's true.
When he catches it in the thing, I don't remember if he's wearing gloves or not, but I definitely do remember it tears his hands up. But you are correct.
Yeah, that is correct. But it's not something that they've chosen to present in the comic this early, right?
Yeah.
It's clearly saying that these people have abilities beyond normal human abilities, right? And I'm comparing it because this is stuff that they've invented. And like, okay, cool. He's like, they've broken off a marble bench top. Like, fuck. Why is his head not caved in? Why is he still alive here? Because they're making the violence. It's an opportunity for the violence to be more gratuitous in the sense that it's more stylized, right? And this is cool little, like they've done like some nice little moments like this when he's falling is a reference to the comics kind of 3 panels down the side, right? Where it's him falling and we're enjoying it. Like it's got these moments of where they've captured the visual of the frames. It's what they've invented in between that betrays a misunderstanding.
And look, part of this is they had to do something live action, right? They had to fill in the panels somehow. And it's the choices they've made as to how to fill in those panels.
But they could have done it with the detectives, flashing back to, this is the evidence, flash back to that moment.
Absolutely.
Evidence, flash back to that moment.
Yeah. They wanted to spend less time with the detectives. So that's where I'm kind of like on their side from a narrative perspective. But the Contrarians did a review of Watchmen and I loved their assessment of it. Like you guys can go and listen to their podcast on it. But a lot of the choices, I feel like we've already gone into tone and how Snyder is portraying the characters and how that is just in how it's portrayed, and then the order in which they're portraying the exact same actions from the book. You can understand why people are saying, well, this is the most faithful adaptation ever made. But to me, if it's portraying those things in a different order or in a different way that sends a different message, that tells the audience to feel differently about those characters, then how can you call that a faithful adaptation? Anyway, in the Contrarians, they did mention an interview with Zack Snyder where he was allegedly trying to be satirical. At the 2009 time, the superhero movies were not horrendously violent. We didn't have Kick-Ass. We didn't have Deadpool, right? And so he was saying, I'm going to portray super graphic violence to make people feel uncomfortable with the superhero movies they've been seeing, right? That was his version of satire, to make people feel uncomfortable with superhero movies in the same way that Moore tried to deconstruct superheroes in comics in the 80s. But I think he just failed to understand that by doing that, he is saying something completely different about violence, about people, about those characters.
Yeah, that they are literally supermen, mensch, that they are kind of have abilities.
Supermensch.
Yeah, and this brings us to the scene that you wanted to talk about, but I've done side by sides with, which is Night Owl 2 and the Silk Spectre, right? Which is basically after the Silk Spectre has a fight, which is also and I'm just going to talk about it, not show it. The Silk Spectre has a fight with Dr. Manhattan, which is portrayed very differently in the comic than in the movie, which is that Dr. Manhattan splits himself into multiple people while they're having sex, right? In the movie, he actually specifically says, I thought you liked this, as in they've done it before. In the comic, she is like, what are you doing? And he says, I thought you might like this, right? It's more non-consensual in the comic, and not in a bad, when she says no, he listens, but it's not something they've tried before. In the comic, it's more like, well, she used to like this and now she doesn't. So it puts us a little bit more on Dr. Manhattan's side. It's very subtle, but it's basically what happens after that she decides to leave him is that she runs to Night Owl and they decide to go for a walk, right? And then this is intercut with Dr. Manhattan going to a chat show where he's going to get interrogated over the fact that he called, as we learn, causes people cancer. Again, look at the beauty. And this is just, I just want to
Doesn't
marvel.
actually, thinks he does.
Yeah, I just want to marvel at the beauty of the parallel storytelling that the comic can do in the medium, which is, again, the blue frames, the colors tell us what is the parallel storyline, which is him getting ready. As basically the Silk Spectre talks to Night Owl about her breakup with him, and he probably doesn't really care. He doesn't really care about anyone. You know, he's probably just, it's mundane, and him getting dressed is like, it's a very good intercutted parallel storytelling. And they've kept elements of that in this sequence, the intercutting, and I've cut them out because otherwise we'll just be here for 3 minutes watching the intercutting of the scene, right? But it ends, there's a subtle plot difference, which essentially Night Owl is having someone repair his door that's been broken by Rorschach, and then they say, oh, you should get a cab. But in the comic, they changed that, and it's Night Owl suggesting to Silk Spectre that they should get a cab. The emotional charge of this scene is different, and it's cut short because it's fucking long on screen, right? This speaks to violence and its relationship with theme, right? So she says, I'm in a bad mood. In the movie, in the comic, it kind of plays with, she's just like, she's happy to go for bad. In the movie, they play it as if they're deliberately trying to pick a fight. You can talk over it, Chaz.
Can I?
Yeah, I'm playing the music. Yeah, of course you can.
Maybe we should get a cab. These are bad neighborhoods.
Yeah, well, I'm in a bad mood.
She kind of looks over it. You know, we stay with them, and look at this. This is them kind of going, look at her like, hey, let's go down the alley. That's not in the comic. She's choosing to go to an alley, and these guys follow them. She kind of looks over the shoulder. Great, they followed us. Right. In this, it's a lot more. In the movie, they're playing it as she is in a bad mood. She's picking a fight.
Yeah, and she's inviting the violence. I would say, in the defense of the book, I feel like that is somewhat in there, that both Dan and her are trying to reconnect over old times and wanting to rekindle what it felt like back when they knew each other.
I agree, except I think it's subconscious.
Yeah, okay.
Like I completely agree that they are trying to pick a fight. However, I think that it's conscious in the thing, and whereas Moore's point is that they've been doing this for so long that they almost can't reconnect and have that sexual chemistry without it, but that has been repressed.
Yeah, and that's a difference to character in that it's subconscious expressing itself versus consciously looking for something, and that then, because they're changing the character motivations or the character awareness, they're having the exact same actions, but then how they feel about it, what they do about it, is then impacting how the audience feels about what they're watching. So you can see from the panels. Yeah.
Do you want me to hit play now? Because it continues paralleling.
But you can see from the panels, the red is not making you feel good as a reader about the violence that you're watching, right? Whereas, man, the compound fractures and the blood. And look, and that's Snyder going, I'm trying to make people feel bad about the violence that we're seeing, but he's not. He's fetishizing it.
Look how much they do not emphasize the specific actions and about how amazing they are at this. In this fight, they are amazing. And then they do that. And this, I want to bring into a little point about worldview. Like this little thing with the knife. Yeah. Like the little cut through him. Slow-mo, like this is not, look at what the panels Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons have chosen to show.
They haven't chosen to show people stabbing each other in the neck.
Like knives are a part of it, but as you say, it's not fetishizing it, right? And the other thing I noticed when we went through this, which brings into like my presentation of worldview, and where because in Watchmen, all the characters get an opportunity to speak what their worldview is, how they think it works.
Yeah.
So at this moment, they've lifted a different part of the comic. So there's definitely like, oh, wait, actually, no, I'm not going to lead into worldview yet, right? Because it brings into what you observed, because there's the resolution of the fight, right? Which in the comic ends with him getting really frustrated, and they standing over, the show's over, and they're like panting, like, look how, like her having a leg, sexual, right? Yeah. And the comic is deliberately frame this as a sexual with, come on, the mob's getting aroused, right? It's deliberately trying to make you read this as a sexual thing. but not as
but
like
it's being critical of it. Like these guys can only get off after beating people up.
And in the movie, it's also that choice that they have not deliberately led the audience there with the rouse as a commentary, and the text telling you that you're meant to see it and then kind of giving you a degree of irony. In the movie, this is where Dr. Manhattan loses his shit. And then he loses his shit, transports everyone. Like, it's like he orgasms. He orgasms. And then it cuts to those guys, as opposed to it being they're getting aroused and they're sexually frustrated. It is a difference. In the previous thing, it's they're sexually frustrated and they don't kind of like fulfill their relationship. And Dr. Manhattan's the same thing. And then he kind of climaxes. This, they've done the sexual gag but missed the point, right? Which is the fact is that this just gets them hot and bothered, but they don't kind of resolve it.
Yeah. I mean, look, Julio has called out in the chat the fact that in the sex scene, which is ridiculous in the book, the sex scene between Night Owl and Silk Spectre is ridiculous in the book as it is in the film. But what the book doesn't have is fucking Leonard Cohen. Is it Leonard Cohen's version of Hallelujah?
Yeah, I think it is.
Buckley's. Anyway, Hallelujah blaring over the top of it as if these two sad, impotent individuals who need violence to get off coming together is something to celebrate.
All right. This is like, I'm going to, just because it's in the PowerPoint and I've got stuff to show.
Yeah.
But when looking at it, they made a choice in this scene that he's talking about violence and Dr. Manhattan is talking about how he perceives the world, that there's no difference between living or dead. It's the same manner of atoms. That is something he says very early in the comic. He actually says it in the first issue, in the pilot. We very clearly understand who Dr. Manhattan is, right? And his worldview. And in the film, they've moved it later, right? So in the comic, it's when Rorschach turns up the first time we as the audience run into Dr. Manhattan and talks to him about the comedian. And the comedian says, he says, you're not too concerned. And he says, the living body and a dead body contain the same number of particles. Structurally, there's no discernible difference. Why should I be concerned? So we know he's kind of indifferent to the death. They've made the decision to push it later in the film, right, to this talk show. And there's a key editorial decision, but it's something I think a writer can have control over.
Cancer.
You're suggesting I was the cause.
From where I'm standing, it's starting to look pretty conclusive.
Even if that's the case, it's irrelevant. A live human body and a deceased human body have the same number of particles.
Oh, this makes it seem as though the death of these punks in the alley doesn't actually matter because their lives are pointless and meaningless, since we're not. The way that they use it as essentially exposition is really problematic.
It's commentary on their lives. Their lives don't really matter. And it's not holding on Dr. Manhattan. It doesn't reinforce that this is Dr. Manhattan's worldview. It actually makes us sympathize with him, and it makes it feel like it's a commentary on the action, as opposed to this is who he is. Whereas in the comic, the panel is him. Look, the panel is I'm gonna bring it up again. The panel's a fucking close up of him saying this shit, right? Yeah. It's clearly like you need to associate. This is who he is, associated with his character. They're actually distancing the character from that worldview, right? Because I think one of the portrayals of Dr. Manhattan in the movie, separate from the comic is more complicated portrayal of it, but they kind of set him up as inhuman a lot earlier in the comic. And in the film, they're kind of playing with his humanity a little bit more. All right. And that brings me back to the TV show, if there's anything else we want to say about the TV show, because there's a very similar worldview given in a more human manner by Cal, because Cal, as we will learn after this, is Dr. Manhattan, but he espouses a worldview, but in more human terms, that is actually very similar.
Heaven is pretend.
So where is he then?
Well, before Uncle Joe was born, he was nowhere. Didn't exist. Then he was a baby. Then he was a child. Then he was an adult. Then he died. Now he's nowhere. Again.
And that kind of, what I like about that is it connects Carl to the worldview. It's almost the first clue from a character point of view that Carl is Dr. Manhattan. And it's done through like character espousing sympathetic worldview.